Welcome to the Bad Vibes Club. So this is the last of 3 conversations with my friend and the wonderful artist Andrea Francke. Today we talk about Eve Sedgewick's essay. Well, actually it's a chapter of a book, and the book is called Touching Feeling, and the chapter is called Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading, or You're So Paranoid You Probably Think This Essay Is About You. In the conversation we talk about paranoia, obviously, and what reparative reading might be. We also talk about Andrea's work with post-truth, and we talk about people like Bruno Latour, we talk about universalism and rationalism, and we talk about strong and weak theory. It's a great conversation. This was my favourite of the 3, and we kind of really got somewhere, I thought, with this. So I hope you enjoy it. Like I said, this is the last one with Andrea, but I'm sure she'll be back on the podcast soon. Okay, bye!
You recommended this text, and this was one of the first texts I read when I got into queer theory, because it's quite a canonical. I think specifically in London. I don't know if it's like, but in the London scene, people really.
They love Sedgewick in general, or this
text. I think because I spent this time reading a lot about it, I think epistemology of the closet is a much more important text. Yeah. But for some reason, I don't think if it's like a Goldsmith's thing, but this text is quite important here.
Sorry, just to be clear, the paranoid text or the touching feeling book?
The paranoid text, just the paranoid text.
Oh, right, okay.
Not the rest of the book. I never heard anyone mention the rest of the book, which I have to say, just quick note, the introduction of the book is amazing. The section on texture is one of the best things I read this month, I think.
Okay.
So we're not going to talk about it, but people should read that.
Yeah, sure.
So I read it about 5 years ago, and it's just a text that I read and I just moved on, and I never thought about it again. And then you recommended it, and I just got obsessed with it because I keep trying to read it and I didn't get it, and I couldn't get why you wanted to read this, and I think sometimes I really enjoy these feelings of like this object that is like clearly not wanting to talk to me, and I'm desperately wanted to talk to it. It gets me really frustrated. So I started researching, and I read there's 3 different versions of the text, which are quite different. So one is from 1994, is an introduction. It's just 9 pages, an introduction for a journal. And the second one is an introduction for a collection of essays on close readings of the novel, which makes so much more sense to me than this version. And then I still read Black feminists talking about this text, and contemporary feminists talking about this text, and all this, and I still cannot get this text. And then yesterday or the day before, I found this conference in Reading, University of Reading. It's a whole day conference they held last year about just this essay.
Wow.
And it's super interesting because they got quite a few people that were students of Sedgwick's or colleagues of Sedgwick to come and speak. And the conference starts by making these 2 points.
You found a text to this conference? Or?
No, I watched the whole conference. I watched 8 hours of lectures. This is how obsessive I got with this.
Fucking hell. Okay.
And they start by saying what is the argument of this text? No one knows. No one has figured out what the argument of this text. I wrote the 3 points. So the first one is no one knows what the argument is. The second one was people that have committed themselves to read this text and make a career of this text, where it's so hard to stay with this text. It's so hard to read it and your mind not to go somewhere else. It's just a really hard text to read. And then the third one, they finish is and what is reparative reading? No one knows.
Okay,
no one has figured out.
That's good to have that confirmed.
And it was just the most amazing feeling of oh, that's great. It's not. And then what then you get from the text, when you just get rid of those things, were the things that I would look for in a text.
Yeah.
Which is, the argument, this kind of model that she's proposing, but she never actually tells you what it is. And then the fact that the text never fully lets you in a sense. It's always escaping from you. So I thought that was a good, good starting point of
Yeah. So well, maybe now we can go back to this original thing. Was this text was chosen by me, whereas the other texts that we've read in the past 2 podcasts have been picked by you. And the reason I recommended you this text was because you had designed some workshops about post-truth for school children, but also for university students.
Yeah.
Could you describe that project, and then we can kind of use this text maybe to like bounce between talking about post-truth and talking about paranoia and reparative reading?
Yeah, so the post-truth project, which is still ongoing, but I don't know what form it's gonna take. It's the idea was that we're living in this moment when people are just throwing. I think lots of people are working around it. You know, these terms like post-truth and fake news, and there's a sort of a panic. It's like an epistemological panic, as if we used to know the truth, and now all these weird people have come and they kind of disrupt it, and we lost it. and I think, to me, it has like really given rise to a really conservative left, which annoys me, because I think we were on the right path, and with all the kind of feminist questions of how truth is constructed, or like science studies, and I think suddenly to give that up and say this is the same as someone paying trolls to kind of publish fake news is a really complicated thing. And I think it's almost adorable when people. I just been reading. The Guardian had like, I don't know, 5 different reviews this month about people writing about post-truth. When people say it's all like the post-structuralists are to blame, or it's like it's all Derrida's fault, which I think is amazing, because you have to be an academic from the humanities to think that Derrida has any impact in the world. Just like if only those people hadn't invented postmodernity.
Yeah.
So I'm quite interested in this thing. And then I thought that instead of that, a more interesting way to address it is to share the tools that all those, I don't know, intellectuals or theorists had raised with other people, and with children especially, just because I think I'm quite interested in working with children, especially in a political way, in a way that kind of enable them to be political beings. So the Post-Truth was a series of 3 workshops. There were like 3 modules, and the first one was looking at queer, feminist, and Black epistemologies. So I'll get like a concept from different theories and just go through them with the children. And then the second one was one day was on algorithms and how they work, what are proxies and what are different models and how they affect knowledge production. And then video essays, which is a form that I'm fascinated, because my son is fascinated with YouTube essays, and I just feel it's like if Adam Curtis had taken over production of knowledge of the world, which is a terrifying thing.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So the idea was like to give children kind of literacy on video essay, so they can understand how cuts work and how it's easy it is to like make a conspiracy or like a weird argument through video, because it's such a convincing medium. And then the third one was looking at different ways that different areas of knowledge categorize something as truth. So, you know, how journalists fact check something is quite different from how sociologists will establish the truth, which is quite different from which I think most looking quite a lot at social science, but also like science. So there's like scientific ways of constructing the truth. Truths are quite specific, and it's really amazing that people assume they overlap when they don't.
Right.
And I think that's always fascinating when like a science says what the social scientist is saying is stupid, is because it's a very different way of.
What's a good example of that difference? Like what's a way that science maybe confirms a theory as opposed to social science?
Okay, I'm not sure.
Not
I'm going to get this on the top of my mind.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
Because I haven't actually run this workshop. Yeah,
okay.
I run only the first 2 ones. For example, science has a lot to do with strong theory, which is something that we're going to come back in the essay. So you come back with a theory to explain, I don't know, a phenomenon.
Yeah.
Very good. And then you test it. So you have this hypothesis and you test it, but then it also has to like appear and be confirmed in like a larger scale. So when you do the theory of evolution, it's not only that you make this theory and then you test it with fossils, is that you see it repeated when we see antibiotic resistance develop, or you see it. So you see how it kind of develops to a larger scale theory of the world.
Yeah.
So it's really fascinating because it has a futurity embedded to that theory, which I quite love. So
yeah, that's interesting. As in, it has to kind of be assumed to always be true.
Yes.
And then obviously the whole point of science is that at some point in the future, it might be refuted, and then it would no longer have ever been true in the original sense that it's posed.
Yes. So it's quite an interesting scale, and it's always like being tested in that way.
Yeah.
Which I think like social science is a lot more restricted. So if you were doing like a sociological paper on, for example, how working class children and middle class children learn in school and behave in school, you have an hypothesis and you have data, and what you're testing is if that repeats in a similar situation in another way, but it almost doesn't have that kind of relation to a strong theory in that sense. It's a lot more localized. I don't think it really scales up to the way of saying like, oh, so working class children or people will develop in those ways, and those ways need to reflect these like assumptions of working class subjectivity or patterns that we saw.
Like it might be that sociological evidence like that, like a study showed or several studies showed that this was the case in this situation, and that you might use that to make policy or to promote different kinds of education or whatever. But that wouldn't ever mean that that theory had to account for all working class children and all middle class children.
Or how the subjects develop in history.
So sure.
So I think it's a lot more horizontal, and scientific theory is more vertical.
Yeah.
But that I just invented now while talking to you.
I really like that, yeah. It's great. Let's stick with that. You've done 2 of these workshops with school children in
Belfast. So it was, as workshops gone, like some things went really well and some things were really bad. So we're kind of rethinking it. And I think I might do it not in school settings, but in gallery settings, because it was quite hard to do that. Just working with children is hard, and I'm not that good at it. And in a school, there's another level of dynamics that you should account for that I don't have the skills to. So maybe next year. But and then the idea is that it's going to be a book.
Great.
For children to read. So they kind of lead the revolution.
I've read this text with groups about 4 times now, and basically I just chopped off. So the essay is in 2 parts. One part is about defining what paranoid reading is, and then what the second part is a woolly kind of definition of what reparative reading might be, which has interesting sections about the depressive position from Melanie Klein's work and stuff like that. But in essence, I just chopped that bit off, and we just have read about paranoia. So like 3 of the reading groups out of 4 have just been about the paranoid reading, because I think it's such an interesting way of understanding what I would call like the metaphysics of critical theory, or what you might just call like the priorities of critical theory. And then it's these definitions of what paranoia is that I just think are so great. Like paranoia is a strong theory, which we can talk about, and paranoia is a theory of like revelation or of uncovering. And I've always thought that about like certain forms of truth, and conspiracy theories as a form of paranoia is a classic one. It's like revelation. It's like, aha, look what's underneath, what's hidden underneath. And I thought they were just really interesting in relation to our conversations about post-truth, as you had a really good definition of post-truth that I trot out to people, but I get it a bit wrong, which is that post-truth is a little bit like postmodernism, in the sense that when people talk about postmodernism, they seem really sad for the loss of modernism. But I guess the point is that postmodernism's pointing out that modernity never really existed in the way that it claimed it did. And post-truth is doing the same thing. For truth, it's actually saying like, I'm not sure truth really ever existed in the way that we might have claimed or hoped that it did. But that doesn't mean that truth doesn't exist, or that we can't find things that are more or less true, or I don't know. But maybe you could talk about that, because you had a good definition.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, and I I heard someone using this, and I've never actually checked it because I really like the definition. But she was saying, and I try to remember her name, but she was talking about the post in postmodernism and in postcolonialism being something that doesn't mean after, but means an examination. So postmodernism is built on an examination of modernism, and postcolonialism is not like colonialism is gone. And that's what's interesting. It's not like when you talk about like compare with decolonizing, for example, but postcolonialism is this moment when you're examining what are the consequences of colonialism and what does it mean. And I thought that's such a, post-truth, when people use it as there was truth and now there's not, is just such a dead end.
Yeah.
And it doesn't give you, first, it doesn't give you any like room for like political change, but it also doesn't give you any room for like intellectual examination, which I think post-truth as being this moment where we're all collectively engaged in this kind of redefinition of, or our understanding of how truth is constructed. Like, I think the idea that before only certain people were allowed to question truth, so you have like Bruno Latour and you have all these people and they can do it because they're really smart and they are a specific type of people. And then suddenly when like this gets distributed to the masses, then it's like, no, leave truth alone. You haven't gone to university. And I think it is a really problematic way of thinking. And there's this scholar that I really love who used to work with Latour called John Law, and he wrote this book called Against Method quite a long time ago, maybe like 10 years. And it's really funny because you can see he's pointing to this moment when he's saying, he's a sociologist, and he's saying more and more you talk to people and you realize they have lost faith because we keep telling them like the economy is getting better, your lives are getting better, and they're looking around and they're like, no, they're not. My life is going to shit. Like, what are you talking about? And this moment has been building up. So I feel like it's really, it's not only unfair, but it's really stupid to then claim these people don't know what truth is. It's like they live truth every day and they've been told that's not real. And at some point you get fed up. And I think then you get space for like paranoid readings and conspiracies because you're so, when someone has been gaslighting you for like 30 years and telling you your life is getting better and you're looking around and you're like, my life is not getting better. And then someone comes and says like, yes, your life is getting worse because, I don't know, like Mexicans or brown people or whatever are been doing this to you. You just believe it because no one has ever reflected what you have been understanding as reality for so long.
And again, because the angle that I was taking on Eve Sedgewick's essay is that what was so helpful for me is that it got me into Sylvan Tompkins' affect theories. And Sylvan Tompkins was a psychologist and kind of psychoanalyst.
And a cybernetic guy. I didn't know that. I'm quite excited about that.
Everyone was cybernetic in the 50s. So I got really into Tompkins and his theories of affect, which I think are really useful when you're thinking about why certain forms of knowledge production are really popular right now, like why the video essay is really popular, or why someone like Jordan Peterson is so popular. And that for me was really helpful, not only, I mean, in like a general way in thinking about the world, but also, I mean, I might have said this to you already, like Sedgewick's essay like made me think about, I've been running the Bad Vibes reading group since 2014, so I've read, and like, you know, and we also read texts and talk about them, and me and Ross do that as well. And so I've got all these texts that I read, and like probably half of them are in the paranoid mode as described by Sedgewick. So I'm reading this description of paranoia and thinking, yeah, like all of these texts are like revelatory and trying to expose something and trying to tell me that everything I've thought before is wrong, and actually hidden underneath all this stuff is this real truth. But obviously, like, none of that has played out in my life in the sense, I mean, you know, it changes the way I think and it makes me have interesting ideas about things. But the reason I'm reading these texts can't be because I really think that they have like some kind of revelatory answer that will uncover or rip apart the world as we know it. And it must be for something else. And I think that it must be for something effective. It must be for something emotional. And the reason I run a reading group and the reason we read texts and talk about them is because of the like feeling of reading and the aesthetic qualities or the tonal qualities or the style. Like part of the reason this essay is probably like read over and over again is because it's like maddeningly written, but also quite funny and like has anecdote in and kind of personal stuff. It was really interesting to me to kind of expose to myself that all the things that I thought I was looking for in theory are actually secondary. All the ideas about like truth or different ways of thinking are secondary to my enjoyment of a text or my enjoyment of talking about a text with other people. And that kind of re-ranking of like, I guess like reason versus, I don't know, emotion or something, or I don't know how to quite phrase that, but like the intellectual qualities of text versus the like pleasure I take in a text, actually they're on a par, or maybe even like the emotional qualities of something are more important.
One of the things that really interested me when I was trying to understand this text was this kind of historical context when she's writing, because she's republishing this as a kind of pedagogical project, and she's talking about new historicism.
Yes.
And she's when she's like describing that way of reading, and thinking that she's teaching, and she's talking about like this academic environment. It's really I just have so many experiences of that when you're like reading in a group.
Can you describe new historicism just briefly? Because it's one of those things that I kept Googling, kept forgetting what it is.
So I never heard the term before, so I had to Wikipedia
it's an American thing, right?
Yeah. And I think I kind of related larger to critical theory at the time. I don't really understand what's the difference between new historicism and critical theory specifically, but it is a mode of like academic writing that has that makes this effort of like finding flaws, which is also a form of pleasure. Like you read and you're just pointing how that person got everything wrong. And I think especially I just had this failed PhD experience and being in the academia like this, there's an incredible amount of reward in like pointing how everybody else is stupid except you, which I think is the same sort of mode of making theory. And again, like that involves lots of pleasure, and I've done it, and I do know it is incredibly pleasurable. But I think what she's proposing, which is really interesting in terms of pedagogy, and I don't know if I ever pass that to my students, but it's that there's a different way of reading where you're just like reading to add things and to kind of like make new things. And there's a point when it gets just really tiring to go to a reading group and all these people just agreeing that what you're reading is stupid, which is why I spend so much time with this text as well, because it would have been so much easier to say like, Matt, what are we reading this? This is really stupid. I don't get anything from it. She's an idiot. You know, like, it is an easy position, and there's so many. If you want to find flaws, there's so many flaws in her thinking, but there's so many flaws in everyone's thinking. And I think, sorry, just coming back to what you said about like aesthetics, and I think in this conference was talking about that what she's proposing is an aesthetics of truth instead of an ethics of truth.
Yeah,
and I think it goes through that. In a sense that you get so much more if you just grab the things that are useful to you and expand them and then use to build something get larger or more interesting, or like take it to the side instead of like focusing on this kind of destructive side of. To me, that's, although I understand how the paranoia applies to the conspiracy, there's a lot of what she's saying that is about not being destructive, or there's no point. Like you go and then you destruct these texts, and then what do you get from them?
You sent me a text by Ellis Hansen, which is very appreciative of the paranoid reading text, but it makes the point early on, if you wanted to, you could kind of completely dismiss the whole text by basically saying that it falls into its own logic of what a paranoid reading is. And it doesn't do that. It goes on to appreciate the text in a number of different ways. But like, yeah, I guess it's a classic example of like a reading group, like spending like a whole week like reading and focusing on text, then meeting up, buying some crisps and snacks and meeting up with people just to point out that it's like has a fatal flaw and therefore has to be totally dismissed, which is not true, because you've read all the words in the essay, so like some of those words are going to have meaning to you and some are going to be maybe aren't going to be so useful. Yeah, it's just really funny like to think of how often like your job as a reader seems to be to point out where they've gone wrong. Yeah, as though that means that like the text isn't worth anything at all. And I guess it does relate to post-truth in that sense, in that like you can either dismiss all the conspiracy theories on Facebook or whatever as like just untrue, or you can think about like where they're coming from and how they're made and who is believing them and for what reason. And that is like an aesthetics of truth, rather than like untrue things are immoral and the truth is like the highest form of morality. But I think that's just a hangover from Plato or something, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? Like literally, like in philosophy, like believing that the poets are all like evil and that the highest like value is something being true.
And I think it's really interesting you're going to Plato, because I think we've been talking about reading this text for like a month, so I've been through like tons of different phases of trying to get it.
I've had a lot of WhatsApp messages of like highlighted text of different essays and stuff. Yeah,
and be like, yes, no, I got it. But I think one of the things that I found hard is because I don't necessarily come from that tradition. So I'm someone who comes from the margins, which is something that I didn't realize until I was here. I just discovered in the last 2 weeks
here in this studio.
Yes, exactly. Next to you.
Yeah. You're like... I'm the center.
You're the universe, I'm the margins.
Yeah. But what do you mean? Do you mean coming from Latin America to Europe, or do you mean...
Yes, and being a woman and being brown and all of these things are things that I sort of understand through this passage. I was just going to share how this amazing discovery in the last 2 weeks that is like Peru, where I'm from, and Brazil, where I grew up, are not the West. We always think we're the West. And then I've been reading and then I've become aware that when people talk about the West, they don't include Latin America. I don't know why, because I feel like we're quite in the West of the world.
Oh, like literally Western, yeah.
But yeah, they would say things, like Western culture. And like Brazil, as it's evolving, might become Western culture. And I'm like, what do you mean we're not the West? And I think my experience with race and all of these things have been quite recent. Maybe in a way that has always meant that how can I say this, like universal truth have never been something that... I'm not the sort of person who's allowed to produce universal truth, and I've never been. And I've never been the sort of person who recognizes themselves universal truth. And my mom, which is an amazing person, she's a university, or she used to teach at university, so she's like really in her own way aware of like pedagogical modes, and her point would always be, it doesn't matter that this doesn't make sense to you. You need to find a way in, because you're never gonna find something that reflects you. So that idea of like saying, this doesn't make sense, or this is wrong, doesn't function, because there's so much authority in that discourse, and at the same time is always wrong. Like, we had this experience of reading Latour together, and I hated it so much. But I can't not read it because everyone is reading. That's like main culture. So I have to find a way to understand why people like it and to understand why I don't get it. Why it's so hard and offensive. Latour is so... I just want to throw his books on the wall every time I read them. I was just listening to this lecture where Anne-Marie Moll and Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, which are people that are like... Eduardo Viveiros de Castro is a Brazilian anthropologist, and he's one of the main references of Latour. And they're having this conference, and Latour is there. And Anne-Marie Moll, which is a philosopher that I love and who was also his student, are saying, why do you use we like that? It's so offensive the way you use we.
To Latour, they're saying this.
Yeah. And I was like, yes, exactly. It's so offensive the way he used the word we. And Latour was like, no, it isn't. And then all these white French dudes raised their hands and they were like, no, it isn't. And they were like this woman and this Brazilian anthropologist saying like, how is this not visible to you? That it just makes it so hard to read your books. And I think having to negotiate those things all the time when you're trying to access this knowledge that is considered universal and canonical just means that maybe you always have to do reparative reading, in a sense, whatever that means.
And you've always been post-truth because the truth as supposed by Western universalism has never been obvious to you, and you've never been able to instantly understand it as truth. You've been understanding it as like a statement from, like a white guy or whatever, to reduce it to that. But why do you... Someone like Latour, Bruno Latour, you don't have to read him, right? Like, why do you read him despite finding him really frustrating?
Well, I think that I had to read it because at that moment, Matt and I went to Open School East together. At that moment, you and John and Ross, all our friends, were reading it. And I wanted in because I want to be part of those conversations. And that's how, that's...
But John hates Latour. but he just
in
had
his
to read
own
him,
way.
yeah, in his own way, but because he came from an anthropology background and had to read him, like, I guess when he was studying in the early 2000s, when probably this stuff was a bit fresher and a bit newer as well. Like, I came to him so late, like, and I'm just like, yeah, well, I'm just like classic, aren't I? Just reading this one and being like, God, this is amazing. Whereas you read him and were just like, oh, this guy's a fucking dickhead. But you persevered because...
I wanted to know why I thought he was a dickhead.
Yeah, okay.
Because I think that's really important. Like, when you read something and it really hurts you or annoy you. That's why, for example, I never went back to this essay, because this didn't annoy me, but I also didn't love it. It was just it was sort of like, it wasn't telling me anything that I felt I didn't knew already. I think Latour, it was just so puzzled. It's like, why are all these people? And it's like, he's, at the time, was a very big art world reference. Like, lots of people were like constantly pointing to him. So it was really fascinating to me. It's like, what are all these people getting from Latour that I'm clearly not getting it? And now I actually quite enjoy Latour. Now that I know what annoys me of his writing, he's actually one of the people that I'm using for post-truth, and I'm using his first research on like doing the anthropology of the laboratory and kind of talking about like how the tools that you use to kind of construct truth have also to be considered, like how are those objects or those tools constructed, those technologies developed. So it is interesting. Like, why do you read theory? Like, I'm obsessed with theory. I read tons of theory. I love it. I think once the pleasure of like having something that slightly gives you like a different way of seeing the world is just amazing. And I do think, again, like going back to strong theory and weak theory, which is one of the things that I think we both...
Oh, we need to define what they are. We didn't do it, did we?
You define it.
Okay, I just looked at it. So in Eve Sedgewick's essay, she talks about paranoia as a strong theory. A strong theory is a theory that defines a lot of things. It has a wide reach and a kind of almost like, in terms of paranoia, like almost a tautological aspect where things come in and they seem to maybe not be defined by it, but if you just rephrase it a little bit, then they kind of come into the fold. So a strong theory in that sense reaches everywhere, and every time you find a new bit of knowledge that you think might be contradictory, actually it gets sucked in under the strong theory. And a weak theory, which she's, I think Sylvan Tompkins again, when she's talking about this, she's saying that like a theory of affect, for example, has to be weak. It has to be very small and kind of only define a very small like situation, and it probably doesn't reach any further than that.
So I think...
Is that right?
I think it is right.
Okay.
And I think during this month of like trying to deal with this text, we had this conversation when I was saying that I think to me that difference doesn't make sense because I don't experience theory in that sense. I think that theory, you come across these different theories, and one theory is good to make some things visible and other things invisible, and then other theory works and makes some things visible and other things invisible. And the beauty of it is that these walls, they don't build onto each other. It's not like you get all these theories together and then you have like a strong theory, or they will make sense.
Yeah.
Like they will never make sense. And I think the more I read, for example, about scientific stuff, I think that makes sense even at that level. Like at some point you try to like get biology to work with chemistry, and it's really hard because they're describing the world from such different positions that you would just almost ruin things sometimes by trying to force them into each other. And in that sense, that's one of the things that to me wasn't... I think it is transformative for quite a lot of people to read that, and to me it wasn't, because I felt that is not how I read theory or how I understand. Yeah,
you've never been looking for a strong theory because all those strong theories are so obviously coming from a very particular, like Western place or however. Someone like Bruno Latour, who does have quite a strong theory.
Yes. That's the thing that annoys me about him, totally. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is, I don't, again, like I really like Latour, but I think some writers are interested in their theories becoming strong theories, and they don't necessarily do this consciously, but like the fact that they're interested in their theories becoming strong theories means that they're going to get more famous because they're going to hammer away at the same theory forever. And that means that if you pick up any of their books, it's always going to be the same theory. And therefore, for example, in the art world, you might get really into Graham Harman or Bruno Latour, because if you pick up any of their essays or books, they're always posing the same thing. So then you can be like, oh yeah, that thing is really relevant to the art world right now. Let's invite them to all, create some stuff, write about art, come and do a talk at keynote thing at the symposium. And I don't think it's their fault, but yeah, I just think that's like, it would never happen to me. Like I would never, and this is just like a quirk of, I just never stick with the same idea for that long, because ideas are interesting for a while. Like I know that's why I'm never going to be like a career academic, but like ideas are interesting to me for a while for certain reasons, and then I move on. I guess that's an art world thing, isn't it?
I think it's an art world. I think lots of people do strong theory very badly in the art world, and they have like one idea and they keep on it forever. I'm not going to name many people.
But you had a really good example of where strong theory doesn't even touch the sides, as it were, like from Black feminism.
Yeah,
right?
So I was reading this incredible American Black feminist philosophy called Kirsty Dodson.
Okay.
And I think this is I think that it's kind of general to Black feminist philosophy in the US and in the UK. So it's not like she didn't come up with this. She just had a really good way of talking about it, which is this idea of you have one thing that kind of joins, or that all Black feminist philosophers have in common, is this completely refusal of fundamentalism. So there's this idea when you start having Black feminist philosophers and thinkers in the 60s, what they're pointing out is that you have this thing called woman, and woman as a category is a category that Black women occupy in a certain way, but is defined by whiteness. So when you think women, you think white women. And then you have this category which is blackness, which Black women also occupy, but actually when you think about blackness, you think about Black men. So the idea is that then you have this subject that is a Black woman that is never represented in neither of those positions, but is part of those positions and kind of can inhabit them temporarily. And that has meant that the way Black philosophers have understood epistemology and knowledge is that you have all these different, I'm going to say positions, but that comes from standpoint feminism, and I think maybe that's similar, but coming from like I would say, whiter position in the US, which is you have all these different ways of understanding the world, and they don't overlap, or like they overlap, but they don't make sense together. They never make a coherent discourse, but you gain a lot, or you can only understand the world by kind of like covering all these different positions, which is quite exciting. Like, so Black feminism never tries to come up with a philosophy.
Almost ontological, right? So they have no being that is the Black woman, whereas like there are categories of Black and there are categories of woman. Yes. But Black feminism isn't interested in categorizing the Black woman as its own category.
Yeah, which I think is super exciting, because they could embrace that and say like, no, what we're going to say is we're going to say Black woman is different from woman and is different from Blackness. So we're just going to do this. And instead they're saying, no, Black women can inhabit women and can inhabit Blackness. And I mean, you can sort of come to like ideas of intersectionality there, but intersectionality is a strong theory, and I think it's a very complicated theory, I would say. So I'm just saying this because I know people are going to listen to this and say, oh, this is intersectionality. And it relates to that, but I don't think...
Why is intersectionality a strong theory?
Because I don't think it was done as a strong theory. So Kimberly Crenshaw was a scholar, like a legal scholar, and she wrote about it in a very specific way. So she talked about how, class, race, and gender relate to each other and they make something different. So when you're talking about Black woman, you're not just talking about Blackness and women, but there's also something that happens because these two things are overlapped that make it specific. I think that's what's... And she's not the first person to say this. People have written about it in the 60s. I have lots of friends in Latin America who are always annoyed because it gets used in a very colonial way when people are talking about that. In Latin America, for example, and you have a history of that, people say, oh yeah, intersectionality. And I think that's what strong theory does. It just like ruins... It like
reduces things.
Yeah, because it has to suck it up. So you can say, no, this is different. We come from a different history and intellectual history. And you're like, no. Intersectionality. I get it. Stop talking. And I think there's a lot of critique from really important Black feminist scholars at the moment. So Akugo Emejulu and Sarah Ahmed has written about this, how intersectionality has become because it is a strong theory, it has become actually a theory of erasing blackness, which goes back to this idea of how black women maybe cannot ontologically exist. So this is a category that was written or like a concept that was written specifically to think about the experience of black women in the world, and it has become this word that actually white people throw around to like make that conversation stop. So they will say like, it would use in a paranoid, it would always, most of the time, be used in a paranoid position when it's like you're making a point about something, and then someone will raise their hand and be like, but how about intersectionality? And a lot of times what they mean is you're just talking about blackness, but you're not talking about gender or class. So I think Sarah Ahmed complains a lot when, or at least quite a few times, of like giving lectures and talking about specific issues about black women, and then, you know, a white person saying, but what about intersectionality? You need to talk about class. It's all about working class experience. It has become this thing that gets used, one, for people to claim that they're woke. So, you know, if you're like a white person and you say intersectionality, you should be clapped because you know intersectionality is a thing. And then second, it gets used to actually stop people talking about black women. And I think, I haven't read it, but I just been reading a lot of Emejulu lately, and she has a whole paper where she analyzes like 30 years of academic peer review papers using the word intersectionality, and like almost none of them are about black women's experience. Most of them are like kind of like bringing again that discourse to kind of examine white men or white women.
And intersectionality is, in one way you could think of it as like making sure that we don't prioritize one form of, I don't know, whatever, like category over another, so like race or gender or class. But then what you're saying is that actually what happens is it gets turned into a way of like establishing a dominance. So someone's talking about race and someone says, we need to also talk about class, which means like, let's not talk about race anymore. And you know, it can happen, I'm sure it happens in many different permutations of that. And I guess paranoid reading is like, we always need to know what's behind the curtain. We always need to know what the most true thing is, and that's always going to be the most important thing. And it doesn't matter about other things which are maybe like, I don't know, like more ambiguous or harder to pick apart, or maybe they're not going to lead to any new form of truth. I think that's super interesting. I think that's what I'm interested in, affect theories that are like Shana Guy's book Ugly Feelings, which is about like the emotions that aren't major, like they're minor kind of feelings, so like awkwardness or envy rather than hate and love and joy and all these like big things, because they're not going to lead to any kind of extreme revolutionary state, which is the classic way of thinking about certain negative emotions, for example, or any kind of revelatory state where they're going to reveal some kind of truth to you. But they do have their own kind of particular qualities, and that's why you would want to think about them or write about them.
Yeah, I think the issue scale is really interesting. I think one of the things that we haven't talked about is this context of the AIDS crisis for this text, and the way that, in a way, this kind of paranoid and reparative, it's applied to text, but actually she's talking a lot about activism, right? And she's talking a lot about reformism and radicalism, I think, in a way. And there's something really paranoid about radicalism, in a sense, that is really helpful, but it can also sometimes obscure the small things you need to do to survive, and make them look like they're less when they're actually, you first of all need to survive to be able to do anything. And I think,
because this, let's just for the listener, but the text opens with an anecdote about talking to an AIDS activist about the various conspiracy theories that are surrounding AIDS at the point where the text is written, which is like AIDS was a government conspiracy, or it's being given to drug users to kill them, or I can't remember what the other versions of it are. But she's saying, although they all may or may not be true, the issue of whether they are true or not can be separated out from what is the most important thing to be doing as an activist, or whatever, as a friend with people who have AIDS at that point.
And I think what she's Sedgewick has a long, I don't know if long, but like she has she's going through cancer while she's writing this essay. So she's also like, I guess, having to understand these things in a small scale as well. So as you know, your body's trying to survive. What's the point of like I don't know what's the point, but sometimes you don't have time. Like I feel like
that's it.
Strong theory to me feels like that. At some points, it's like this luxury of like being, and I think that's why there's this relation to like academia and like money, because you need to have a very big amount of money to be like thinking about these big issues and just like spending all your time trying to fit everybody under your umbrella so you can publish all these books and things. Well, I think I'm quite interested in this knowledge production that happens in the ground, and that sometimes is thought as naive, as if disconnected from bigger questions of bigger political issues. But actually, I think we don't give enough credit to people usually, and people are not. I think in general, people are not stupid. And for most people, survival is a real thing that happens every day, and that requires a level of knowledge production and requires a level of theory making, and you're always trying to understand the world so you can, because that's what theory is like trying to understand the world so you can exist in it. And I think the theories that get produced through those experiences, which are weak theories, are actually really interesting, and maybe they don't give you the truth, but maybe theory doesn't have to give you the truth all the time. Maybe they give you something else that is more interesting than that.
Thanks so much for listening to the Bad Vibes Club. We'll be back soon with new interviews. I've just started recording. I'm really excited to share them with you. So yeah, keep your ears out. All right, cheers, bye.